Hey, life groups, we've made it to week 12. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for journeying with us all together, all through Ephesians. I'm hoping that the series has been a blessing to you. I'm hoping that God met you somewhere along the journey and spoke some great things into your life. Hopefully you got some insights. And what I just simply wanted to do as we close out the series is just kind of do one big sweep right through it and just kind of highlight some of the things we've covered so far. So if you remember chapter 1, where that big long sentence Paul opens up from verse 3 to verse 14, and he just pours out what the gospel is and what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. He uses words like we're blessed, we're chosen, we are adopted in Jesus Christ according to the purpose of his will. And so again, I'm hoping in that you were able to capture all that God has done for us, for you in Jesus Christ, how much he loves you in Christ. And then in chapter 2, Paul shares how this happens. How is it that we can encounter God's great love, his mercy, his grace, his forgiveness? How? It's all down to verses 8 and 9 of chapter 2. We are saved by grace through faith. That's faith in Christ. And even that faith is not our own doing. It is the gift of God so that no one can boast. We are his workmanship. The NLT says we are his masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus for good works. At the end of the day, it's not about earning God's love and favor. It's not about meriting God's love and favor. There's nothing you or I can do to earn it. It's simply an act of grace. God saved us by his grace simply because we placed our faith in Jesus Christ. He moves on from there into chapter 3. And chapter 3 is kind of his personal testimony, and he takes time to pray. He prays for the Ephesian Christians that they would know how deep God's love is, how broad, how wide it is. The language that he uses, the height, you remember that? The height, the depth, the length, the width. It's exploratory language, right? It's Paul praying for the Ephesians, telling them there's so much more to God's love for you to discover. There's so much more for you to know, so much more for you to experience. And so he, through the prayer, is exhorting the believers there at Ephesus to continue on their walk and journey with Christ, because there is so much more. In chapter 4, Paul begins now to turn from describing what the gospel is, what God has done in Jesus Christ. Now in chapters 4, 5, and 6, of course, is the practical application of that. In other words, what does it look like to be a follower of Christ? What does it look like to live a gospel-centered or gospel-shaped life? So in chapter 4, he begins talking about the ministry and how God has called every believer into the ministry. There's a ministry that is your ministry given to you by God. And so he talked about the gifts of leadership in the church and different offices, shepherds and pastors in the church, to equip the saints, the body, for the work of the ministry. You have a ministry. You have a mission field. It might be your school, your workplace. It might be your very home, the block you live on. But you have a God-given ministry that honestly is not only given to you by God, but you're accountable to God for it. He's placed you in that work situation, school, home, neighborhood for a reason. He moves on from there at the latter half of chapter 4 to talk about our personal responsibility to God in terms of not only just ministry, but in terms of living a holy life. In other words, yes, we're saved by grace, but we're called to respond to that grace, right? In other words, as God has bestowed his great grace on us and mercy and favor and forgiveness and all that he's done for us in Christ, there should be a response. And the response that Paul calls for is a holy life. And the way he described it, if you remember, is simply by putting off the old life and putting on the new life in Jesus Christ. That's your responsibility, and that's my responsibility as followers of Christ, that we're continuously shedding the old ways, the old habits, the old attitudes, and we're adopting the new ways, the new attitudes, being more Christ-like. And then in chapter 5, he moves from individual response to the gospel to what it looks like as a family. Remember that? In the latter half of chapter 5, we talked about the roles of husbands and wives and parents and children. And all of that was meant to say simply that this is not just about the individual, but this is also about the family. That we are to express our faith in all of those roles, whether we're husbands or wives or children or parents, whatever our role is in this life, our faith should be expressed and lived out in those roles. And so in the latter half of chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 6, he gives us some real practical advice on how we do that. How should we live as people of faith in those various roles? He closes out, of course, last week with chapter 6 on the fight of faith, spiritual warfare, putting on the whole armor of God, standing in the strength of the Lord, not in our own strength, because if we're serious about following Christ, it's going to be a fight. But don't worry about it. I read the end. We win. No, seriously. We win because of what Christ has accomplished on our behalf. What Christ did for us on the cross, and subsequently what he accomplished as he rose from the dead 3 days later and now sits at the right hand of the Father, making intercession for us, an advocate for us. So as we close out the series, why don't you take some time with your group to just talk about maybe something during the journey that struck you. Maybe it was a certain passage, maybe something you didn't hear before, or an insight that you had never really considered, and it really blessed you or helped you to understand your relationship with God, or perhaps what God was doing in this season of your life. I want you to go ahead and spend a few moments talking about that and just celebrate the end of our journey together. Thank you so much for sticking with us. 12 weeks is quite the run. It's been an honor and a privilege for me to just walk with you through Ephesians. God bless you.